Okay, so now we are going to be able to do sort of an extended Q&A discussion. And I should tell you that Mr. Murray talks about a lot of things other than just free speech. In fact, last night here in Dallas, he was defending the idea of a universal basic income as a solution to this whole issue of artificial intelligence displacing workers and self-driving cars and that sort of a thing. So we can do some wide-ranging questions. On your tables, there's some 3x5 cards and there's some pens. And if you would please write your questions down on a card and just hold it up, someone will come along and collect those. And we will get to as many of them as we can. I think every table's got 3 or 4 cards on it. So please take advantage of this opportunity. The market doesn't necessarily solve the problem you're talking about because of the power of the credential. I mean, we've seen universities like the University of Missouri, where the market does seem to have spoken and enrollment is down and that sort of thing, right? But at a lot of the most elite universities, parents are not going to say, I'm not going to send my child to that elite university, just because of the power and value of the credential, right? So markets in and of themselves don't necessarily do this for us, do they?
I'm glad that you raised that point, because I should have mentioned it in the speech. No matter what happens, parents will be lined up to try to get their kids into Harvard and Middlebury and places like that. Right. And they aren't going to change. But it's not just that at places like Missouri, you're going to see a market response. You also have this increasing understanding by a lot of people that a BA doesn't really mean anything anymore in terms of getting a job. And employers know this for a fact. Knowing that somebody comes in to interview for a job and he or she has a BA means nothing unless you know where that person got the BA and what their major was. And a lot of students are realizing this too as they pile up mountains of debt. A lot of parents are realizing it. You're having increasing options on the internet for distance learning and other things that are way cheaper. I think we are going to have a big shakeout over the course of the next 10 years where a lot of colleges, particularly small private colleges, are going to bite the dust because they're too expensive and people know they are not getting value for money, and you will see a market response. And the elite colleges are completely exempt from all of this.
Because of the size of their endowments and
and because they want their kid to get a Yale diploma because they think that's going to be the open sesame to a job at Goldman Sachs.
It's interesting because a lot of us share two sort of contrary opinions at the same time, one of which is that too many people are going to college in general. I mean, a lot of people should be learning trades rather than going to college. But yet at the same time, speaking of the universal basic income, we're aware of this idea that increasingly jobs are only going to be available for people with advanced degrees, right? So, you know, that also seems like a collision that's coming. If people are going to college who really don't belong there, but on the other hand, your only hope in the future is going to be an advanced degree.
Yeah, but not an advanced degree in anthropology or English literature.
Right.
And
right.
That's also becoming increasingly obvious that colleges, the number of majors that can lead to a job is a very small subset of the majors that are being taken.
Yeah. I wonder, not to demean art history majors or whatever, but there's only so many jobs for those, you know. I mean, you have these bubbles. I mean, a couple decades ago, we had too many people in dental school, you know. But the market does have a way of correcting those things. But I don't know, where do all the art history majors get jobs? Do they work for a government somewhere or something?
As a history major, it worked for me, but don't use me as an example.
Okay. Why don't we get to some of these questions? Yeah, I think here's someone who asks, what does all this mean for the rest of us? I think a lot of us have sort of ominous feelings about what happens when all of these fragile college graduates become our leaders. And, you know, you've described this sort of coming conflict in academia, which is interesting, but there's a greater trend that's going to happen is that all of these students raised this way, reinforced in college rather than corrected in college, are going to become the leaders of the next generation. And what does that mean for us?
Well, you have two possibilities. And one is that a lot of them will be quite successful in life because they will stay within the bubble. So they will go from Duke to to Yale Law School, and they will get their law degree, and they will be a successful lawyer. But it's also probably unlikely that they will become somebody who figures out a brand new business model for law firms and makes $1 zillion. You have people who have a lot of ability, and they'll be able to apply that ability within their narrow sphere, but they're not going to be the risk takers. They aren't going to be the entrepreneurs because they haven't been beat up enough in life to have the resilience and stamina to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And in that case, one would think there's a good chance that a lot of the people who are political leaders will continue to come from more varied backgrounds. The problem is that a lot of the people who are most in the bubble will rise pretty high in the bureaucracies. And so you will continue to have secretaries of commerce who are making rules for truck drivers, long-haul truck drivers, and haven't the least visceral idea of what the problems and priorities of truck drivers are. So it may be our political leaders will be okay. In terms of the people who are unfortunately in rule-making positions and policy-making positions, I'm afraid the isolation is going to result in the kinds of alienation and segregation and isolation that I talked about in Losing Ground, and that has created so many problems and probably indirectly created Donald Trump.
Right. I thought your comment, you briefly talked about parenting styles, and I thought that was interesting. I'm in my 50s. I felt like I had, and it was probably pretty typical, I had parents who loved me but also let me get beat up in life, right? I mean, when I turned 16, my mother marched me down to the corner grocery store and said, "Could you give my son a job?" And I was expected to work at 16, I have a son here in the room. I didn't do that to him. You know what I mean? It does seem to me that a big part of this is a generation of parents who thought that it was their job to make life easier for their children than theirs was. And I wonder if that's not the single biggest factor that's going on here, is parents who thought, one of the things that we buy with increased prosperity is better, more luxurious childhoods for our children.
Yeah, and you're right about that. Once again, we have a distinction between, I think, the population at large and a subset of the population that's overrepresented in this room. And the population overrepresented in this room are upper middle class or higher, and smart and ambitious for their children, which means it has been taken to mean that, my child is going to be applying to a selective school when he turns 18, and so we've got to make sure that they have all the right extracurricular activities, they've learned all the right, they've done the right amount of volunteering at the local soup kitchen, we punched all the buttons so they can get into this selective college. There are relatively few parents in the country who send their kids to selective colleges, but a lot of people in this room do. And that has resulted in a very regimented childhood. And also we have developed, for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, an enormous unwillingness to put our children at any risk whatsoever. And so you have these extremely closely monitored childhoods where kids don't go out and ride their bicycle down the street and play unsupervised for several hours at a time. All of this is done both with intentions for doing the best for your child in the long term by preparing them to go to a selective college, and also you want to keep them safe as children. It's all with the best of intentions, and it really limits the ability of your children to grow. Here's the question I put when I'm in front of audiences of adults who have kids. We have a big mix age-wise in this room today. And I say, to what extent have you systematically deprived your children of the things that made you who you are? And I think that's gone a lot.
What advice would you have? We do have a large number of students in the audience. What advice would you give to high school juniors and seniors who are about to go to college and encounter restrictions in the classroom? Restrictions on speech in the classroom.
Yeah, that's a good question. What would I do practically speaking?
It is a problem, isn't it? Because you don't want to pick a fight with a professor necessarily.
Yeah, well, you also don't want to, come on, when you're 18 years old, you do want to fit in. And you don't want to identify yourself as this weirdo, oddball. You know what I think? If you're going to college, here's the most important thing that is within your control that you can do. This is very serious advice. There are all sorts, in most schools, course evaluations that are published, and they are, a lot of these run the student things, but professors get reputations. And you know what you're going to look for? You're going to look for the professor where there are complaints that he's too demanding. That I turned in a test late and he gave me a D and he wouldn't change it and that kind. So look for those kinds of evaluations, but here's even the more important things. Choose your courses wisely. You can still put together, by the way, I'm a big fan of a liberal education, a classic liberal education. I may have talked in ways which made that doubtful, but I really am. But colleges will give you no guidance these days on a core curriculum you have to take. You have to create that core curriculum for yourself. I didn't do it when I was at Harvard 50 years ago. There was the greatest Revolutionary War scholar in history, a guy named Bernard Balin, teaching Revolutionary history, and I said to myself, oh, I've read a lot of American history on my own. I don't need to take that. Idiot. You know, and so I took a course on Sino-Soviet history instead, which, you know, that's a graduate course, but it's not. You choose courses that are taught by professors who have a reputation for being tough and that are tackling the big topics. Take basic economics. Take basic history of Western civilization and so forth and so on. And also if you're in the science, or even if you're not in the sciences, take some basic science courses. You are on your own in choosing courses, but at almost any college you end up at, you can get a superb education. But the college will give you no help whatsoever in going for the courses that you need the most. We are not identified by our socioeconomic class, that it is the individual that we deal with across the table from us as opposed to any group membership, and that white identity politics are as repellent to the ideals of America as any other kind of identity politics. So I think you go after the Richard Spencers by reasserting more passionately than ever the American creed that was consensually accepted for so very long.
I'm going to try to squeeze in two more questions. We'll end our lunch after these two questions. And I know many of you will want to sort of charge the stage and greet Mr. Murray.
Let's not put it that way.
That's true. That's true. Different kind of charging of the stage. I know many of you will want to politely approach the stage. And feel free to do so, but I have to tell you that the Sumners scholars will be doing a private session with Mr. Murray right after this, where they get to ask their own questions, and I don't get to filter them. So come forward, say hi, but don't tie him up because he has one more obligation before he's finished. I have several questions here. You talked about the new scientific data that's going to come along and challenge the social sciences. What is your view of the impact of genetic data? There are privacy implications. I mean, should we be worried about sending off our cheek swabs to 23andMe or Ancestry.com? I mean, it's pretty fascinating information that comes out of that, and you also get a heads up about some possible health problems you may face down the road. But are we not giving adequate thought to some of the privacy-related complications that may come from that?
I would say you can make a more general statement, which is we have not thought through all sorts of ethical issues associated with genetics, and that we have shied away from that word, we have shied away from that topic, and maybe this is a good time for me to tell you what I think the policy implication of all this new knowledge is going to be. It is going to be an emphatic reinforcement of the need to treat people as individuals. That you cannot judge on the basis of group membership, however you're defining group, very much about a person by statistical tendencies. There's just too much overlap in all these distributions. You can learn more about a person's IQ by talking to them for 5 minutes than by any identification of group or otherwise, socioeconomic group, I don't care what group. You're going to learn way more just by interacting with the person. So both ethically and as a matter of practice, we're going to know lots more about all sorts of things, including genetics, that make us who we are in some broad sense, and it requires us more than ever to make the judgments we make about the persons we interact with on the basis of who they are, not what group they belong to.
Well, that would be good.
Yeah.
That's actually an optimistic view, right?
Yeah,
if science leads us to reassert.
Yeah, this is not a political statement of the policy implication. It's the scientific statement of what the appropriate policy implication is.
Well, I should probably stop there because that was a more optimistic answer than you're going to have to my last question. You've already said you're pessimistic about the ability of us to deal with these things through some sort of political return to founding principles and that sort of thing, and I think most of us would probably pessimistically agree. But I got a couple questions here. It was interesting how, with the election of Donald Trump, suddenly some folks on the left and in California suddenly rediscovered federalism. Right? It's like they thought they had this unique idea. Hey, we should be able to not have Washington running everything, which caused some of us to bang our heads against the wall. But do you have any optimism whatsoever that there's a potential for more devolving of power to the states, block grants, more federalism? And, for those of us who've always been federalists and thought this was always the solution to many of our problems, might some of this be a blessing in disguise?
I think actually you may be right. And it's not just that under the new regime in Washington that liberals are saying we'd like a little more independence out in the states.
Right.
Think what happened with the marijuana laws during the Obama administration. Washington State and Colorado passed these laws, which are patently unconstitutional because they are conflicting with federal drug laws. And if there's one aspect of the Constitution which is held firm, it is that federal law trumps state law and local law. Well, guess what? The Department of Justice said, well, as long as Washington and Colorado fall certain broad guidelines, we aren't going to prosecute. That is the thin edge of a wedge that I'm very glad to see. And that I think is continuing in the last couple of years for precisely the reason you said. There's lots of people seeing advantages in federalism, and you probably are going to see the California separatist movement and others that want to secede. Well, you know what? Short of factual legal secession, the next best thing is a lot more autonomy for those states. Yeah, I think those pressures are out there, and I welcome them. In one sense, you can say, well, what's going to happen is that we'll become even more segregated politically than we are now because all the people on the left will rush to Portland, Oregon, and all the people on the right will come to Dallas, Texas. But
that sounds fine to me, actually.
At this point, we're already pretty politically segregated, and I don't. The ability for people to live their lives as they see fit, which I think is the heart of the American project, that idea. If that involves more segregation than I would prefer from other perspectives, I'm willing to live with that. Because if you can get it in the air again, that people should be allowed to live their lives as they see fit, as long as they give the same freedom to everyone else, that is such a lovely framework on which to hang progress. It may start with progress where we're just trying to get away from these people we don't agree with. As time goes on, I like to think people are going to say, this is a virtue in itself that we can continue to build upon.
Well, that's a fabulous way to end. Please join me in thanking Charles Murray. It's been our great honor that you've all joined us today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope you will pay attention when you get invitations in your email boxes from IPI about future events. Please have a good rest of your day, and thank you again very much for joining us. Thank you.